Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from concept to closure. Can I just get a thumbs up if I am audible? Okay, thank you. My name is Tshiamo Nare, Social Development Program Coordinator at SAWEA, and it's a pleasure to guide you through today's session. To our SAWEA members, partners, and stakeholders, and all attendees, whether you're joining us for the first time or you're one of our Turbine Talks regulars, thank you for being here. It's always encouraging to see both familiar and the new names joining these conversations because it really reflects the growing interest in how South Africa's wind energy sector continues to evolve and mature. Before we begin, just a few quick reminders to help the session run smoothly. Please keep your microphones muted during the presentations. You're welcome to submit questions via the Q&A tab. We'll address these during the interactive session right at the end. And just a note that the session is being recorded and both the recording and presentations will be shared with you after the series. So just as some background, South Africa's wind energy sector has matured significantly over the past decade, and the conversation is no longer just about project origination or procurement windows. It is increasingly about how projects are structured, how are they financed, how are they contracted, and how they're executed, and ultimately managed across their full life cycle in a way that remains bankable, compliant, and commercially sustainable. At the same time, the industry is operating within a far more constrained and competitive environment that's shaped by grid access limitation, evolving procurement strategies, and heightened lender scrutiny, increasing ESG and transformation expectations, and growing complexity around execution and long-term asset viability. Today's discussion forms part one of a broader webinar series that aims to unpack these interconnected issues from both a commercial and a practical industry perspective. And in today's session, we'll specifically focus on early stage project structuring, procurement and contracting consideration, investor and lender expectation, and the broader commercial frameworks that influence whether projects ultimately achieve financial close and successful delivery. For part one, we are very pleased to be joined by representatives from RMB and Thebe Investment Corporation who bring extensive transaction and investment experience across the infrastructure and renewable energy sectors. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Tebogo Mohwaduba from RMB. Tebogo joined RMB in 2018 as a transactor in infrastructure sector solutions and has extensive experience across debt, equity financing, PPPs, and renewable energy transactions. Her transaction experience includes involvement in several major infrastructure and renewable energy deals, including the SAWEA Energy Hybrid Power Project, multiple refinancing transactions, BEE funding structures, infrastructure PPP financing, and renewable energy portfolio advisory transactions. She's a chartered accountant, a registered SAWEA assessor, and also holds certifications through the CFA Institute and ASISA Academy. Today, Tebogo will take us through early stage bankable project structuring and procurement strategies. Tebogo, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Tshiamo. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you and good morning, everyone. Looking forward to the conversation this morning. I just want to quickly put up the presentation. There is quite a lot to go through in the time we have, so I'll try to just focus on the key aspects, and like Tshiamo said, the presentation will be shared after if you want to delve into a bit more detail. Can you see the presentation on the screen? Thank you very much. So this morning, we just want to talk through the early stage bankable project structuring and procurement strategies from a banking perspective, and the broad discussion topics will be around these 5 themes. So we're looking at due diligence and all the considerations that go into that for a developer and a sponsor, the concept of EPC fully wrapped versus multi-contracting models, and procurement frameworks that balance risk, cost, compliance, and transformation requirements. We will be talking a bit about contractor evaluation methodologies and market inclusivity, and then structuring for bankability and investment confidence. But in summary, it's number 5 speaks to the 4 items above, so it'll just be a brief summary of those aspects, because that forms a bankable structure that can have investor confidence. So on due diligence and unpacking all considerations, as a commercial bank, we look at projects at a stage where they are near bankable or in bankable stage. So during development, that is outside of our scope. So our industry colleagues like the DBSA and the IDC, they have that mandate to be part of that development phase of a project. From an R&B side, we would expect all of these considerations to have been looked into and almost pre-packaged before we can look at the lending structures. So some of the key considerations to look at, I won't go into all the details on the right, but just to highlight the key themes, it's very important to obviously have a commercial and revenue framework, which means you need a revenue line that is quite stable and probable in terms of actually materializing. So we would see that as a near final PPA, and we say near final because we don't really want anything to be signed at that stage, because as lenders, there will definitely be a review of all the various documents, and there might be issues where we pick up bankability issues. So we want to raise those issues and raise those comments before anything is actually executed. But having a near final PPA agreement is quite helpful. You need an off-taker that's credit-worthy to show that commercial viability of the project, and your tariff structure, your indexation, and how that's going to work, and if your grid connection has actually been secured or is in the process. We also look at technical development readiness. So specifically speaking on wind, your resource assessments by advisors, whether you've optimized your turbine selection and the layout on the actual land where the project will be, the energy production estimates, because that'll speak to your revenue line, grid studies that had to be done, and basically all the critical parts from the technical side. We'd expect some work to have been done there. Very key one is permits and land. So environmental approvals obtained, all your leases or land rights, road access or plans to expand roads, community and stakeholder engagement. So all of those need to be quite developed or a work in progress. And contracting strategy. So for a more experienced contractor, this would almost be pre-packaged, where they know that they are going for a fully wrapped strategy, which we'll talk to a bit later, or multi-contracting. They would be well aware that key contracts need to be in advanced form in terms of your turbine supply agreements, your actual EPC agreement contract, your O&M contract, and how that risk is being allocated. So if there are delay liquidated damages, if there are performance guarantees, it must be quite clear what sits where and who bears that risk. And if there are split contracts in the mix, those interface risks need to be outlined quite clearly. And then we move on to the financial model and economics. So the financial model is a very important aspect of any project. It's basically the heartbeat of the project, where you test viability of the project, where you make sure that you can adhere to typical commercial terms like ratios, tenors, any reserving you need in the project, and of course solving for the equity IRR, and whether the model can handle sensitivities around the wind resource, capex costs, any delays in construction and commissioning, any forex flexes, interest rate flexes. So all of those assumptions need to be tested so that the model is quite robust and can undergo a lender process where it has to go to credit, as well as a model audit process where all the assumptions need to be tested, and all the assumptions aligned with the technical aspects like your wind resource and your degradation. And for instance, if we're looking at solar, so all of those aspects need to be in quite an advanced version of the model. And the model will be reviewed by the lenders. This is an ongoing process all the way up to financial close, just to make sure that by the time it reaches the independent model audit process and financial close, it's very well structured and there's very little margin for error. And then, of course, your project sponsors, you need to have a funding plan. So you need to know what the equity requirements are. So, for example, if you know your project is in a range of 80 to 85% debt funded, so the 15 to 20% would have to come from equity. So it doesn't have to be cast in stone, but there needs to be a process. Will it be the sponsors or the developer's own money? Will they be getting funding from elsewhere? Do they need to start an equity funding process? So it needs to be quite clear what the needs are from an equity funding process to make sure that we have a fully funded process. And then as sponsors, governance is also very important in terms of how the shareholders interact. So that will be covered in the memorandum of incorporation and the shareholders agreements, just so the operational side of how the sponsors interact is also quite clear. And then quite important is information flow. So for all the stakeholders of the project, which is why a data room is quite key. So this needs to be updated with all the various documents. You can have a technical folder where all the items that would be needed by a technical advisor or an owner's engineer would all be collated and updated on a regular basis. You could have a folder for your legals where the sponsor's legal advice as well as the lender's legal advice know they have a depository where all the contracts are and where the latest versions of everything is saved. So there needs to be quite a clear audit trail and information flow just to make sure that all the work streams will be able to run. And of course, this is updated on an ongoing basis. And then from a lender's perspective, so now in the perfect world, all those previous steps have been met or are a work in progress. From the lender's side, we would then look to appoint advisors who are skilled in the various aspects of the project, who would then be mandated to the lenders to help us with the due diligence process. So that would be our legal advisors, so our LLA. Now they would look at all the contracts from the PPA to the finance docs to land, environmental and economic development requirements. We'd also contract an LTA, the lender's technical advisors, and they would conduct the site visits for us even before close, just to do the assessments. They would review all the technical documents. They would also review all the technical inputs that inform the model, and then they would be able to draft a report to us to outline all the risks and how they rank them and how they can be mitigated or how they can be allocated appropriately. And the LTA stays on the journey with us even into operations, where they give regular operational reports on how the project is performing and how things are going. But the most critical phase will be leading up to financial close, and especially during construction, where we need them on site almost every month just to make sure that milestones are being met, and if there are any delays, what the plan is to get back on track. And then our insurance advisors, they sometimes come in a little bit later in the process when the project is near baked, just to make sure that all the insurance needs of the project during construction and operations are covered, and that the premiums are accounted for appropriately in the model, and that there is insurance cover, and for the life of the project, we can make sure that we are comfortable with those insurance risks. And then on the lender side, every bank is different, so there will be some some committees where you need to take this deal through, and this can run in parallel with all these other work streams from a legal, technical, insurance perspective. The key thing is that we need to have a bankable financial model before we can even approach our credit, just to show that it's a robust project and can withstand all sorts of sensitivities. And the model audit process will also be quite important, leading all the way up to financial close. So this will be a condition for us to actually issue any funding once we get that independent review and someone to tick that box. And then our credit application then will be submitted with key contracts. They don't have to be in final form. It can be advanced drafts and initial reports from our advisors. And then we can approach committees to show what the plan is, what they can expect, and what risks we are identifying and how we can mitigate them so that we can run those approval processes in parallel all the way to close. And for very big projects, it's very normal to have several approval processes where you have an initial committee sitting, then you might come back again when there's advancement in the project, or if the committee itself gives you conditions that you need to go back to the sponsors and say, hey, these risks were identified, we need to mitigate it in this and this way. We can either address that through the contracts or through the model or whatever the case is. It's quite an involved iterative process over the duration up to financial close. And then in terms of EPC and multi-contracting, so what this simply means on your EPC contract, in a single fully wrapped structure, you basically look to one guy that takes responsibility for everything. So the design, supplier, construction, commissioning, it's one party that you address for all of those aspects, and it has its pros. For instance, there's more certainty because you're interacting with less parties, and the information flows much quicker, and there are less negotiations. So in theory, the process to financial close should be faster, but that's not certain because anything can come up in the project that needs to be addressed and delay financial close. It might come at a premium because you are looking to one guy to cover everything and to contract with you and also to negotiate with. And the pricing certainty, financial close date certainty, there's more visibility on that theoretically, and basically you look to one party to wrap this whole project in all the different aspects and take responsibility for it. Whereas in a multi-contracting structure, this can be a bit complicated because you're separating major aspects of the contract to separate parties. So for instance, your turbine supply agreement can sit with one guy, whereas your balance of plant agreement sits with another, and your grid connection is done by another party. And in this case, it's very important to have a very strong sponsor that can manage all of these risks, because it all has to be integrated at the end of the day. So you'll have an interface agreement to basically govern how all the various stakeholders interact and how it all comes together. So it's not to say that one is better than the other. I think it's quite dependent on the type of sponsor you have, their track record and what they've done in the past, but you certainly need a more experienced party to look at a split contract structure to put everything together, because you don't want to allocate the risk incorrectly and then have gaps in terms of where your recourse is. And then in terms of procurement frameworks, balancing risk, cost, compliance, and transformation. I think in the South African landscape, we're quite aware of how the REAP program has been running. It's quite a mature market, like Tshiamo mentioned earlier. So in terms of the frameworks, it's quite standard and quite clear what needs to be achieved. But just to talk about some broad categories. So in terms of your risk allocation, it needs to be clear who's responsible for what aspect of the project. So whether it's construction, performance, and any delays, it needs to be clear if anything goes wrong, who is the party responsible. And lenders need to be very aligned with this so that it's the contracting is airtight, and should things go wrong, which they often do, and sometimes in ways that you wouldn't have predicted, you understand where the recourse is. In terms of the cost optimization, the processes like we've seen in REAP, where it's all about getting the right tariff and a project that meets all the procurement framework requirements, makes it quite a competitive process. And I think we've seen in our market over the past 5 to 6 years where the Chinese have come with very competitive pricing packages and basically caused the market to have a different face on the construction front. And all of that's considered, even with a very competitive pricing. There are other aspects of the project that one needs to consider. So it's not just your EPC price, but after the construction is done, there is still some time where the contractor is responsible for certain aspects of the project in terms of the quality, in terms of any defects, in terms of basically that commissioning and handover process to make sure that everything is correct. And if there are any issues, someone has a check to make good of those gaps. So it's not necessarily just a pricing consideration that you look at. You need to look at a construction company that can be a partner going forward into the early operation period. And then regulation compliance, I think it's quite clear how the framework works, especially from a REIT perspective, where you have environmental regulatory requirements, your permitting, grid code compliance, and our legal teams on the sponsor and lender side are quite experienced in this aspect. So it's an important DD item, but the market is quite mature in terms of what's needed. In terms of transformation and localization, this is very much dependent on the program. Is it REAP? Is it private power? So it just needs to adhere to whatever those particular procurement framework requirements are, and to make sure that it's a prioritized DD item to make sure that the various thresholds are met. And then in terms of contracting, like we mentioned earlier, EPC versus multi-contracting, and making sure that the risk allocation is well understood. And then in terms of contractor evaluation methodologies and market inclusivity, it's quite clear to participants in the industry that technical capability comes top. So you could come with the best price, but if you don't actually have the technical capability to deliver, the viability of the project comes into big question. So having a track record is quite important. Using proven technology and that execution capability is very, very key. And this is not to say that the industry isn't open for new participants, but it would make sense to have a partnership with an experienced contractor that can basically be part of the process, because these are huge undertakings, and if anything goes wrong, which it almost always does, you know that there's someone backing your developers, or it's a strong sponsor that can actually make good of the issues and make sure the project becomes operational. Reputational risk is a very big one. So from a banking side, we have to take all the sponsors and the names and the structures through a committee for desirability, just to see if there are any issues that are flagged on the world searches, any negative media, any legal judgments, or any political affiliations that concern us. Having a credit-worthy contractor is important, because you need financial strength to be capable of providing those guarantees that are needed, providing the bonds, and making sure that if there are any damages that need to be backed, you have a strong balance sheet to cover that. Health, safety, and environmental. This goes without saying in terms of incident history and safety on site. That's quite important. And then commercial competitiveness. I think that speaks to contracting in terms of pricing that we spoke to earlier, and making sure that the market benchmarks align. And execution and delivery, which is strongly linked to the technical capabilities. You need a contractor that's got access to the market in terms of skill, labor, and has a plan in terms of the procurement rules around that. For instance, if you need a certain percentage of the labor to come from the local community, supply chain resilience. I mean, we've seen on the solar side where panel prices skyrocketed. Strong sponsors need to be able to absorb that, or take the hit, or have a game plan on how to roll out the equipment on an ongoing basis without jeopardizing the project, which has been a challenge, and fairly so. And then in terms of transformation and inclusivity, BE credentials and what's required for the project, it's very important to adhere to that, especially without appearing to be fronting, but actually to produce a project that's actually speaking to those BE requirements and needed credentials. Using local subcontractors and small to medium entities in terms of labor and equipment supplies, also important. And the key thing, especially if you're outside of the maybe more government focused programs, is to make sure that you adhere to any economic development obligations that are in the PPA, and that this item is DD'd correctly, and that there actually is a plan and it makes sense and can be executed. And then on structuring for bankability and investment confidence, like I said earlier, all those aspects that we spoke to are basically summarized into achieving this. So key is that you need revenue security and a revenue line that's actually sustainable. You need project de-risking in terms of making sure that your technical aspects are sound, you've got all the permits, and that your contracting structures make sense. And then the financial robustness, which speaks to the financial model and a model that can take sensitivity testing and various scenarios being run. And of course, that the equity return still makes sense. And then, of course, the lender process. So running the due diligence with the technical, legal, and insurance advisors, committee approvals, and then recommendations that come from those approvals make for a better baked and a fully baked project to ensure that we actually reach financial close and go into the construction and operations phase. And just from an R&B side, if anyone would like to get in touch, we've just added the slide with the various sector heads that take care of different aspects of infrastructure in the team. My colleague Pranisha, who takes care of traders, SAP and advisory, and is quite involved in private power, is also on the line, and we work very closely in this aspect of the business. So if anyone needs contact details, those will also be on the presentation that's shared. And I'm a little bit over my time, but thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Tebogo, for that insightful presentation. Your presentation really provided, I think, a very practical and detailed overview of the complexity that's involved in moving projects from concept towards a financial close and execution readiness. As a reminder to participants, you're welcome to submit questions through the chat or Q&A function, and we'll try to get through as many as possible during the session. And building on the discussion that Tebogo has started around structuring and bankability, our next session will focus more on specifically on investor expectations, capital consideration, and how investment institutions assess project readiness and long-term value creation. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ebrahim Makda from Thebe Investment Corporation. Ebrahim is a corporate finance principal at Thebe and joined the organization in 2018. He's a chartered accountant with transaction experience spanning petrochemicals, tourism, food, energy, and business service sectors with a strong focus on mergers and acquisitions and corporate finance. Prior to joining Thebe, he was a manager in the financial engineering team at KPMG. Today, Ebrahim will unpack investor expectations, capital requirements, and bankability considerations. Ebrahim, thank you so much for joining us. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to present on my screen. Just let me know if you're able to hear me and able to see the presentation.
Yes, we can hear you and we can see.
Sounds good. Thanks and welcome to everyone. I think what is important for us to start with is just when we contextualize how does equity see sort of early stage, is just to fully capture what are we talking about in the three-part webinar. So I guess in the first out of the three, we're going to be talking at, call it more of the concept pre-FC phase, and what does that actually encompass. I think traditionally, institutes like Thebe and Tebogo raised R&B, we generally prefer coming in at financial close, just because we're trying to maximize the risk return reward. I think as we see the returns on our later routes and the CNI space sort of diminishing slightly, in order to meet our expected equity returns, we probably need to move up that risk curve. And as we move up the risk curve, we need to understand those risks and adequately quantify them and see how do we manage them in order then that the risk reward matrix still stacks up. So what we just outlined on probably the first slide is just the timeline in what we would traditionally see a project run through. So where we would have RB as the traditional banker towards the FC side, and us also as Thebe and most sort of institutional investors coming in at the FC side. We do as equity look to participate somewhat in the development stage of the project pre-FC. We haven't made it personally as Thebe fully through the concept stage yet, but as time develops and as we understand the risk profile, we might move up that curve. And to contextualize, I mean, in terms of the development phase, most of the things that Tebogo already touched on and what they would use to assess the project's bankability. That would include technical studies, as she outlined, the pre-execution version or the pre-version of the actual PPA, and that's the offtake negotiations, because there would be certain elements of participation that the equity and the banks would require. The financial modeling, the due diligence, as well as the EPC engagements. Where I think we are in the discussion today is probably somewhere in between the concept and the development. And the concept is really one that starts off with an idea, the site identification. What do we do in terms of the land agreements, the wind resources, and how credible they are, our grid access and the environmental approvals. So when we're talking and to conceptualize today's presentation, we're probably talking about the equity that would flow and is required in between the concept phase and the development phase, and how do we identify those risks and monetize that to get a particular return. In terms of the presentation, and just like a quick summary of certain items that we're hoping to touch on, and we'll touch on in it briefly now and more fully as the presentation goes through. We're probably touching on 4 aspects. The first being the investors' expectations or the investment expectations. And item 1 generally would flow through towards the capital considerations. And really this is about moving up the risk curve to effectively capture a bit more of the equity margin that generally is retracting at financial close. So in order to still deliver on equity expectations, it is likely that we need to move up that risk curve, but we can't move up that risk curve blindly. And the key point about that is, at this stage, we're obviously introducing a lot more uncertainty into the equity than we would at financial close. And so it is important that we still need line of sight of how these uncertainties become certain as we move along the project lifecycle. A key aspect of this is the development value uplift, and what are those key milestones that need to be met in order then to capture those and monetize those. The next aspect is about how then, once that capital is raised, do we then look towards, we call it capital preservation. So how do we make our rand last slightly longer during that development phase because of the level of timing uncertainty that certain of these procurement negotiations face. It's also critical because whilst we'd have milestone payments at FC, the traditional funding during this phase is generally more on unencumbered capital than encumbered capital, and therefore has a higher cost associated with it. The bankability considerations in that phase, whilst Tebogo went extensively of what do the traditional banks look at the phase of the concepts, we're probably going to be looking at particularly the DFIs and early stage investors and what their considerations are prior to milestones. I think where we'd start on is, what does the investor partner typically look at and why? All right. I think where the common theme of moving up that risk curve and managing the balance between the risk and the returns is effectively bridged on the slide. I know it's quite wordy, but we just try to give you quite an extensive insight into that. So one is just identifying and understanding what those risks are, and then the potential uplifts in those rewards, and what are certain key value drivers that we need to focus on in order then for this project to move up that bankability curve. So your typical risk that you would see prior to FC is obviously the land access and the servitude risk. Do I have that land option secured? And what is the strength of that contract and for how long? That would also depend a lot on when this project is being bid into. So is it being bid into a round, or is it a CSI project that CNI project that I'm going to effectively secure offtakes for? The other key consideration, particularly in this aspect, is the grid capacity issue. And the uncertainty around our allocation and your grid participation allocation. With wind particularly, we have somewhat of an advantage just because of the level of overbuild probably of solar relative to wind. But it's key to understand where we are in that life cycle and how are we ensuring that we manage to get the adequate grid participation for the grid allocation for the megawatts that we are producing. The next is on the environmental authorization. Remember, on environmental and regulatory permits generally take a bit more time in the process, and therefore the timing regarding this is uncertain, but we aren't able to then move on this as a key aspect, particularly to outlay capital towards. The next is around our offtake agreements, the community and stakeholder alignments, and the balance then on the risk are probably going to move into the next point about how then do we capture the risk on the development side, and that would be through obviously the additional revenue sources that would come from participating higher up or earlier in the project lifecycle. Those would include obviously the development premium and to some extent the development fee. And in terms of the capital preservation and development management fee, this would take or be earned over time. So it might be accrued and then paid to someone as you get towards FC, linked to particular milestone payments. There are obviously the success fee linked milestones, and traditionally certain parties that are developing and working effectively at risk would have equity participation once we reach FC. A key aspect of the returns is that whilst we in this phase, we probably accruing for these, but these only get fully monetized on FC. So having line of sight between your development timeline as well as your timeline towards FC would be critical to ensure that we are working towards a particular goal. It doesn't mean that we accrue for it. It's no use accruing for something that can never ever be monetized. So ensuring that we reach to FC to the project would ensure that these additional revenues are effectively monetized, and therefore there is some goal congruence between the development phase as well as the reaching of the FC phase. Some of those key considerations and key value drivers in the early stage that then effectively gets us increasing towards certainty of financial close is going to be securing the grid access and improving our energy yield certainty. I think the next one is around the permitting, which we touched on the environmental as well as the regulatory approvals. This would typically include also your grid access, right? Then depending if we're bidding in a round or in a CNI project, the level or advancedness of our negotiations with the offtake agreements and structures. The next one would be obviously achieving a bankable EPC solution. and therefore reducing the schedule uncertainty. In terms of the capital outlay and preservations that we talked about, obviously during this phase, the key criteria is that we probably funding was traditionally unencumbered capital rather than encumbered capital. The unencumbered capital is, although it's flexible or a little bit more flexible in terms of the level of how it's deployed and the timing of its deployed, it does generally attract a higher risk tolerance, and therefore it is a bit more expensive. It is used if it's used effectively, it would be able to bridge the gap between the concept and the development phase and eventually FC. In terms of our encumbered capital, the goal is to reach from unencumbered capital to effectively refinance that position of that unencumbered capital at financial close, i.e. monetizing the risk that we had taken up front. As we move towards the encumbered capital, we'll probably link to our project obligations, and that's when we have a fully secured PPA, etc., fully backed off-take agreements, and quite milestone driven, so quite rigid on when that capital can be deployed. In terms of the bankability considerations that we typically look at, we're probably going to introduce traditional banking probably when those certain key milestones are met. The traditional banking portion about this is probably for a more robust risk profile, with strong emphasis on contracted revenue, and when a lot of those uncertainty questions are eventually answered. Generally, in the phase that we're looking at, we have a lot of the uncertainty still in place, and those uncertainty eventually attract more capital as we move through certain milestones and objectives towards financial close. So securing the land is going to be quite a big item. The grid allocation, our environmental approvals, the wind resource is actually validated by an expert. The offtake agreements and negotiations are far. We have advanced negotiations with the EPC contractors, and the financial model is effectively built and quite robust on the above mentioned items. I guess the last 2 points, this really moves towards when we get it bankable towards the traditional banking in terms of the legal due diligence and our community structures being established. So who are the sources of funds that then can fund these early or development stage? We generally look at pure development equity. Traditionally, these are your traditional developers that take that project risk up front and eventually then monetize them as we reach financial close. And they continue playing quite a strong role in identifying these as well as then developing it in towards financial close. A strategic partner, probably like Thebe at this stage, looking towards backward integrating into that risk curve, just in order to capture some additional yields. The DFIs, being the development banks as well as your international DFIs, generally make funding available for early stage development, but those are limited and are quite milestone orientated, which generally talks to the middle column on this. So long as we're able to hit more of those milestone payments, the ability to access that DFI capital becomes quite critical. On the commercial banks and the institutional banks, are very limited FC by the commercial banks and institutional investors. I guess in closing, the market is obviously shifting towards a certain amount of lower returns as these projects become more cookie cut in a way, and therefore, in order for investors to capture more of those returns, they do need to assume certain risks. But assuming those risks blindly is probably something that that the investor doesn't have appetite for. So what the key with developing and sourcing developmental finance is to understand what the equity investor actually is looking for. And hopefully today we had a bit of a flavor of that. And as we then look towards what that equity investor looks at, we then are able to move towards developing the project in those to achieve those milestone payments and therefore increase the accessibility towards funding. Yeah, I'll pause there. I think probably got there in time. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ebrahim, for those valuable insights. And thank you again to both Tebogo and Ebrahim for sharing your expertise and industry perspectives with us this morning. We have received quite a bit of questions. So to continue the conversation, we'll now open the floor for discussion. And thank you so much for your engagement with the Q&A and the chat box. I'll hand over to my colleague Vincent to facilitate our interactive Q&A session. Vincent.
Good morning, colleagues. Thank you, Tshiamo. First question is to Tebogo. How are lenders thinking about curtailment risk on wind projects, given the impact it can have on revenue and DSCRs? Is it mainly a modeling downside case issue, or do you also look at specific PPA protections like deemed energy or curtailment compensation?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, it is quite a sensitive topic, and I think it's a combination of both. So first prize is you want to address it in your PPA so that you have something, a clause that basically addresses this. So whether it's in your deemed energy clauses or whatever the case is based on the transaction at the time, I think first prize would be that. And then in any case, we would definitely be expected to run downside scenarios on the robustness of the model to handle any yield downside. So we maybe would be asked to run a 5, 10, 15% haircut just to see that is the model robust enough to handle that or recover over a reasonable amount of time with that risk. So it's definitely both aspects, and first prize being addressing it in the PPA upfront.
Thank you, Tebogo. Next question also for you. What are the key factors that have rendered certain wind projects effectively unbankable? Additionally, are there recurring pain points or trends you are seeing across projects today that lenders are becoming increasingly sensitive to from a bankability perspective?
Thank you. So, I mean, I guess you see these over time, but for instance, you will pick up that a project is overgeared when there's a bit of an issue in the project that it cannot absorb that glitch in a certain period of time. So for instance, if you forecast a certain yield and that doesn't materialize, then it impacts your debt service, your cover ratios, and puts you into lockup or default arenas, which is quite dangerous, and you don't want that on a project. So I think overgearing is probably an issue because you leave very little room for your project to absorb any issues, and that also speaks to ratios, where the ratios would be quite aggressive and not enough buffer for any projects underperformance. And also with the resource risk, I mean, you can have your resource assessments, but if there's climatic phenomena that it impacts what actually happens, that has an impact on your project and compared to what was originally forecast. And if the project doesn't have enough buffer to absorb that, then the impact is quite direct, and then you have to start discussions around tapping into reserves to cover debt service and the like. So I think being too aggressive is a problem, and not leaving enough buffer for your project to absorb any issues along the way.
Thank you, Tebogo. Then just another question before we go over to Ebrahim. Given that banks often prefer strong sponsors to reduce risk exposure, how are the banks thinking about supporting broader market access for emerging local players? Is this something the bank sector is considering?
Thanks for that question, and it's quite topical, where we want to be in an industry that's open to more participants than the usual list. I think what's key is that we are definitely open to this, but it needs to make sense in terms of delivering the project. So what we've seen with one or two projects where there's a new entrant in the market is that it works when we couple them with a more experienced sponsor that's been in the industry for a while, because of the size of the projects, all the different risks that need to be allocated, and also all the different issues that may come up during construction, which is the peak risk period of the project, and also into operations. So those types of partnerships are working very well. Not to say the projects don't have issues, but they certainly have a better chance of recovering from them when there is a partnership mindset around partnering a new entrant in the market, a new developer, with someone with more experience and able to deliver, and also to wear some of those unforeseen risks that come along.
Thank you, Tebogo. Question to Ebrahim. With the magnitude and complexity of projects increasing, do you think the integration of various investment partners, banks and DFIs will increase going forward?
Yes, definitely. I think one is that they're becoming more complex, and two, we generally at FC seeing lower equity returns to institutional investors. So in order then to make the returns either increase or more robust, as well as dealing with the level of complexity in the projects, it would definitely require a higher degree of collaboration. And that collaboration obviously moves and increases as the institutional investors or institutional equity investors increase their participation in the development phase, or earlier development phase, rather than at FC.
Thank you, Ebrahim. The next one is there a growing appetite for flexible or hybrid financing structures in renewable energy projects, and what factors are typically influencing this? Ebrahim, you there?
Apologies, I was on mute and I was talking to myself. So what I was saying is that the answer is definitely yes. It does requires to be competitive in this market and to remain competitive in the different sort of rounds or renewable rounds, as well as the CNI space, where costing is so sort of tight and the tariff adjustments, etc., are quite competitive. Becoming more flexible and more innovative in the way we fund projects does allow for one to deliver a certain tariff while still maintaining the returns. And so it would become increasingly relevant, and the reason for it is because of the competitive nature. I think one would definitely need to sort of consider some of those risks, as Tebogo raised, not over-gearing the project or becoming too clever on the financing side, because we're also do want to deliver a project that then also runs for 20 years and runs robustly for 20 years. So it's getting that balance right that will become very critical.
Understood. Thank you. Last question to Ebrahim. What value can strategic investors add beyond simply providing capital? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. I guess it talks to the nature of the strategic investor, right? As that strategic investor invest in sort of multiple projects and would sit on the boards of those projects and participate in sort of some of those strategic guidance as the project moves through its life cycle. The insights and learnings that come out from certain projects and generally can be used as a risk mitigation tool or flagging a certain risk earlier on and therefore addressing it to make the new project more robust. So I guess it talks to the nature of the strategic investor and the experience of it. You probably want to attract someone not only with financial capital, but also the know-how in terms of having the experience of closed multiple projects, having been involved in the board and the strategic guidance on those. It's quite critical.
Thank you, Ebrahim, as well as to Tebogo. There are no more questions coming in. Tshiamo, back to you.
Thanks, Vincent. As we wrap up today's session, I'd like to thank our speakers again from RNB and Thebe Investment Corporation for sharing their expertise and perspectives. Thank you as well to everyone who joined us and participated in the discussion. Today's conversation highlighted that achieving bankable wind projects requires far more than simply securing procurement opportunities. And I think our speakers really highlighted all of these complexities. We hope that this session provided useful practical insights into how these different elements come together across the project lifecycle. And as mentioned earlier on, the session forms part of a 3-part series. And we look forward to continuing the conversation in the upcoming sessions. Part 2 will be on the 19th of May and part 3 will be on the 26th of May. On behalf of SAWEA, thank you once again for being with us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.